Hello and welcome. I'm going to go over the introduction to flash photography today. I've been doing flash for years and years and years, co-author with Brian Peterson on his flash book, and I've written my own flash book on outdoor flash photography and so on. And what I'm going to cover today is the fundamentals of flash photography. Most people can kind of be pretty confused, and flashes are extremely complex today. Tougher to learn than the camera, in my opinion. So I hope to kind of break the ice on many of you, to give you a basic understanding of how flash works and in the fundamentals. Then you can at least go back with a handful of knowledge and pull the manual out on your flash and better understand how everything works in that regard. So we're going to cover that, and I say, let's get started. What I'm going to talk about specifically today is flash fundamentals and how it all works, how you can apply flash effectively for good results. And then we're going to cover TTL, which stands for through the lens metering, as well as manual flash, different ways to handle light quality, bounce flash, diffusers, and more. So basically there's two main purposes of flash. One is to supplement existing lighting. That existing lighting is often the sun if you're outside, but it could be indoors, like photographing somebody inside of a building or a manufacturing plant, or you might be photographing a birthday party at a company you work at, as a hypothetical example, where they know you're a photographer and they want you to take pictures of the party. Flash will be very beneficial. And then another example is where you're creating light where none exists. For example, you're photographing a party at a dark nightclub, for example. You want to take a couple pictures with your camera of your friends, and there's not enough light in there to take a picture. So you use flash to add light to your people. So that's going to be what we're going to talk about now. So here's an example of supplementing existing light. On the left, we have a woman, and you can see the sun hitting the side of her head. And, you know, the exposure on the front of her is not bad, but when you add flash, look what she looks like with the picture on the right. Here's an example of where this young lady would be a silhouette against those neon lights, but by adding flash on the front of her, she's now normally exposed against that background. You can use flash creatively. Here, I did light painting on Metate Arch in Grand Staircase, Escalante in Utah. And, of course, it's a creative use of using flash by adding colored gels. We're going to talk more about that. And then another way to look at using flash creatively is I'm on a rafting trip in Oregon's Rogue River, and it's starting to get dark. The sun's about to set. It's getting dark. So I have the flash on my camera, and I just pointed at her, and the flash added a nice sharp edge to her, but the half a second exposure made the background all blurry. So that's kind of fun. Then, of course, getting the flash off the camera is something you're going to hear a lot about when people talk about how to use flash as best you can. And that is, in this case, there's a flash inside the tent to illuminate it and make it look like it's a nice and warm, glowing tent with blue-colored snow outside and so on. So here it's very useful for creating a storytelling image by making it feel like it's nice and warm in there. And then there's different types of flash. And in this case, this picture shows an old Canon I used to have that's got a pop-up flash, and cameras still come with pop-up flashes. They're very easy to use. If you're in program mode and you're photographing the Christmas party inside, program mode, when you press the shutter, most likely it's going to make that flash automatically pop up because it knows it's dark inside and it knows you're going to need some light. So here, the pop-up flash is very, very handy so you can continue to take pictures. The disadvantage of a pop-up flash is they're very low in power. That means the distance that it can send light is going to be very low or short. And in this case, again, an older Canon camera, it basically said it can send light about 10 feet. And as such, that's not very far. But it'll help in situations where you're kind of in a bind and you need a little extra light. The other thing you do not want to do when you're using a pop-up flash is have a big lens shade on there. As an example, My Canon 16 to 35's got a lens shade that's really pretty thin but rises high at the top and high at the bottom. Well, this flash is so close to the axis of the lens that it's almost like the lens is sending the light out. But in this case, the flash pops up, sends the light down along the lens, but when it hits that lens shade, it's going to create a shadow in the foreground if you're shooting really wide angle, like at 16 millimeters. And so you just want to be careful with that type of thing. Moving on to the more powerful flashes, they are external on-camera flashes like this Nikon SB800, an older model on a friend of mine's Nikon. Again, very easy to use. The advantage here is you pop it in, you turn it on, and if you use all automatic settings, you just take pictures. The nice thing about a flash like this that mounts in the shoe is they got more power. They're more higher output, for example, meaning it can send light to a greater distance. And you can also take it off the camera, which you can't do on that pop-up flash. You can take it off the camera, move it anywhere you want, use remote triggers in a wireless flash setup, and that's really fun. Now we'll talk about light very briefly. Every day we have light, or at night we don't have light unless we make it. When it comes to ambient light, you have the sun. You have zero control over the sun's position. You have zero control over what angle that sun is shining light on your subject. And you have zero control on how bright it is. So you use your own tools to create or to control the brightness of the flash and so on. Then you have supplemental lighting, which is either a strobe or a flash. And in these cases, you have absolutely full control over them. You can control how much light they output, which basically affects the brightness of the flash hitting your subject. You also have full control over where you position it, such as you want to create side lighting or frontal lighting or backlighting. So that's the nice thing about supplementing, total control. So as an example, here is ambient and flash, my wife and I on vacation in Hawaii. And you've got a nice sunset. I metered for the sunset, so it would be nice and, kind of colorful as it could be. And the top picture, of course, is the ambient light. But notice that she becomes almost a silhouette. But when I add the flash, she's normally exposed, and the exposure for the sunset in the background hasn't changed. So there's one advantage of using on-camera flash to brighten up a very dark subject. Now, there's another thing that absolutely requires consideration, and that is the sync speed of your camera. So that's going to vary depending on the camera model. For example, my Canons, I have two Canons. One has a shutter speed or a sync speed of 1/160th, while the other one has a sync speed of 1/250th. And this is really important, because it's going to tell you how you're going to expose for that ambient light if you're outside. Now, most cameras, I believe, are 1/250th, but again, not all of them. Like one of my Canons is not a sync speed of 1/250th. And I'll throw in here, before I move on to how this works, is I'm excluding FP, which stands for high speed sync. That's a separate setting in your camera that you can choose that allows you to use pretty much any shutter speed, but there's huge drawbacks to it. There's huge benefits, but there's huge drawbacks. So, okay, now shooting modes. Most cameras come with a program mode, an aperture priority, shutter priority, and a manual mode. And many cameras come with a lot more. If you look at the photograph, you can see on the left side of the dial there all these creative shooting modes that you can go in and say, well, I shoot a lot of my kids playing sports. So you can set that to 1/250th if your sync speed's 1/250th, and it'll choose the aperture that is going to go with that shutter speed, and it'll fire the flash. I mean, you set all this up. And so there's, some advantages to that. But we're not going to talk about any of these creative shooting modes. We're only going to talk about these 4 modes right here. Generally, they're most widely used. Here is my grandniece with chocolate around her mouth and a perfect situation. You can see it's bright outside, but she's under cover of a carport, so it's darker in there. I added the flash and it filled it in nicely. So back to the shooting modes here. The first one is P mode or program mode. It's very easy to use. It's for fast shooting. It's great when you don't care about the quality of your picture. Usually your flash in program mode is set to ETTL, which means Canon's version of through the lens metering. So that means the camera sends out that signal to meter the subject and then it outputs enough flash. The next thing I got here is 1/60th to 1/250th is the shutter speeds that program mode will use. When you are setting to program mode, it really, in most cases, limits the shutter speeds from 1/60th to 1/250th. It's program mode. It's meant for fast photography without too much creative tools applied to it or creative techniques applied to capturing your photograph using program mode. Now, with that said, they've added in features that allow you to change the range of shutter speeds in program mode. And I'm not going to go there because I want to, more importantly, differentiate between program mode and the other shooting modes and why you're going to want to use other shooting modes in some cases for creative photography. So for now, I'm going to leave program mode at 1/60th to 1/250th of a second. And you can go into your manual later and determine if you want to change that range setting. So to summarize program mode, I'm going to call it party mode. That's when I use it. It's the holidays. I'm the family photographer. When everybody's over and we're enjoying, I'm going to take some pictures and I'm going to leave it in program mode so that I get good, sharp, non-blur pictures and the flash will light everybody nicely. So our next mode is aperture priority mode. And as we already know, you pick the f-stop, the camera picks the shutter speed. And this is great when you want a really good ambient light exposure outdoors or even indoors. And in this case, you can pick any shutter speed that's available on the camera and you can adjust your aperture, and the flash in ETTL mode, meaning automatic metering, will automatically adjust the output of that flash so that your subject is properly exposed. This is the way I was brought up. Aperture priority always picks the shutter speed appropriate for the aperture chosen and the ISO that's been chosen and the amount of available light outside. Now, they threw in years ago that aperture priority mode could be set in your menus to act just like program mode, meaning 1/60th to 1/250th shutter speed range, nothing longer than 1/60th. Well, to me, that is silly. I can't understand why they do that. And because I teach flash and I've written a couple books, I always go in and I say, turn that off. You want aperture priority mode to do what it's supposed to do. If you need 1 second of a shutter speed because you're outdoors and the light level's really low and you're taking somebody's picture, you want 1 second. And turn that off in your menu. You don't need aperture priority to act like program mode. And as such, that's my recommendation. So, okay, now if you're going in here, as an example, I talked about the holiday parties. On the left is P mode, where it shows 1/60th. Because it's dark in there, it shows the longest shutter speed of 1/60th. And then on the right is aperture priority mode. And this was more about a 15th of a second. You can see there's detail back there, but the camera is purposely underexposing the background just a little tiny bit to make the subjects, which are lit by the flash, to show up. So that works way better. That's the way I want aperture priority mode to work with me when I'm using wireless flash. Okay, now we're on to shutter priority mode. Here again, we already know you pick the shutter speed because you need a fast shutter speed to make sure something doesn't blur. The camera then picks the aperture. You want to use this when you need that fast shutter speed. So let's say a mountain biker's coming by, riding by you, and you want them to blur just a little tiny bit. So you chose 1/30th of a second. Perfect. Now it's going to pick the perfect aperture to go with that. And as long as the ISO is set appropriately for this scene, it will pick that aperture, and then you can continue shooting away. It's great when the background is kind of important, but not super important. And here's another important point to keep in mind. Think about all the shutter speed settings that you have available, that range. And then think about how many aperture or f-stops you have available. Way more shutter speeds than f-stops. So if you decide, I'm going to use 1/1000th of a second, and it tells you that your f2.8 lens is not going to allow in enough light because you're using such a fast shutter speed, you're going to need to increase your ISO so you can have a properly exposed picture at f2.8 1/1000th of a second. So in this case, I may set my ISO to auto when I know I need a fast shutter speed to freeze a subject, and I'm using the flash to kind of fill in the shadows on the subject. So that's an important point. Okay, now just as an example, taken at dusk, when the light level's getting low, taken at dusk, P mode, chose again 1/60th of a second. Aperture priority chose 1/4 of a second. And you can see the aperture priority is normally exposed, but here's the drawback in low light situations. She's blurring. So you either have to go way up on your ISO, kind of avoid long enough shutter speed to cause a blur, and still get a properly exposed picture. I'm throwing in at the bottom here says shutter priority mode would really pretty much look the same. So it doesn't matter whether you use an aperture priority or shutter priority, it would pretty much look the same because they work the same. It's just you're given priority to the shutter speed in shutter priority mode, and you're given priority to the aperture in aperture priority mode. I don't use shutter priority mode hardly at all, the TV here. So some Nikons and Sonys, and this is going to vary by camera. I'm throwing it in because I kind of gave up trying to be an expert on how flashes work like I was when I was writing books. I've given up on trying to keep up with other cameras besides my Canons because so much keeps getting introduced, so much keeps getting changed, I can't keep up, like Photoshop. Photoshop changing every week. So if you've got a Sony or a Nikon camera, and there could be more models, and you put it in aperture priority mode, it's going to act like P mode unless you turn on slow sync mode. And I don't know what it's called in Sony. I do know it's called slow sync mode on the Nikon, but I don't know about Sony's. That's just kind of giving you a heads up. In my Canons, I go into the menus and how aperture priority mode is supposed to work on Canon cameras, and I just changed the menu setting. When I was doing my book, and this has been years ago, the Nikons, you always chose slow sync. And I've heard same with Sony. So you need to check on that. Now, let's talk about the modes of the flash. ETTL, ITTL, and I don't know what the others call it, but it's through the lens technology. This means when the flash sends out, there's a pre-flash in a lot of cases that goes out to your subject, measures it, and then tells the flash how much light to output for a proper flash exposure. This happens in a blink of an eye. The good part about ETTL is it's all automatic. But then when you move on to manual mode, there's nothing automatic. There's no metering, there's no nothing in manual mode. So if you choose manual mode, you instead adjust flash output manually. Full power, half power, quarter power, and so on. And in that case, manual mode is a very useful tool for consistent flash output. And I'm going to show you more of that. Then FP is high speed flash. I've talked about the shutter sync modes. My Canon, again, one was 1/250th of a second. The other one was 1/160th of a second. When you select FP flash, you can choose any shutter speed that your camera's got. And you may be thinking, I'm going to leave that on all the time. Well, hold on. I'll show you why you don't want to do that coming up. Okay, multi-mode is when you want a stroboscopic flash, like the old disco days where the flashes are just going. You can have fun with that. I'll talk more about that coming up. Okay, and then front and rear curtain. I'm going to talk about that coming up. But front curtain means when you press the shutter, and this is default on cameras, when you press the shutter, the flash fires. In rear curtain sync, when you press the shutter, it takes the picture, and right before the shutter closes, it takes the flash fires to be added to your image. Okay, So a little bit more about TTL through the lens. Again, fully automatic flash. You use the camera settings to determine what you want. Then the flash chooses the proper flash output. And as I just mentioned, it sends out a pre-flash that measures the distance from the flash to the subject, and it sets the flash output once you do that. Now, how it does that metering has changed over the years. It used to be the autofocus point. Whichever autofocus point is where it measured the flash. And then, at least on my Canons, they started going to a center-weighted thing, which is kind of like those metering modes when you're going and looking through your camera and trying to pick a metering mode. There's a centered-weighted one, and it tends to go more that way. And then here's an important thing about automatic TTL flash. When you change the f-stop, the flash changes the flash output level to ensure that you still have a proper exposure. So if you were at f8 and thinking, oh, I want more depth of field, you change to f16, take another picture, they should look the same, or at least extremely close. How does the flash work? Well, again, flash meters from an autofocus point or it's center weighted. So if you look in the top picture, an old camera where I had the I had the autofocus point on her, perfect exposure. And in the lower left, again, perfect exposure with using that autofocus point. But when the autofocus point went over to the far wall, it's perfectly exposed, but she's way burned out, way too hot from the flash. And then, of course, on the right is center weighted. And this is the way I think most tend to be these days. So if your gear is old, you might want to check and find out. Now we'll talk about flash range. When the flash light leaves the flash, it has a certain amount of distance that it can go. So if you look at these pictures from the Canon flash, on the left side, it's set to ETTL. I got f2.8 as my aperture that's been chosen. It can send light to a subject as close as 2 feet or a subject as far as 18 feet, and it has enough power to ensure that each of those distances are going to be properly exposed based on the flash's output ability. But change that to f22 and look what happens. 0.5 in front of the lens, half a foot to 2 feet. And as such, that is a very shallow range. So you could use f22 for something close, like you're taking a picture of a butterfly and you want a lot of depth of field, you choose f22. It can do it as long as that butterfly and flower are not more than 2 feet away from the camera. So that's how you would want to use flash range. Now we're going to get into the theory of flash. And that is shutter speed controls the amount of time allowed to expose the picture. Think about that, and of course that's kind of a given. 1 second is certainly much longer than 1/1000th of a second. And as such, the shutter speed is going to darken or lighten your background based on your shutter speed for the most part. Now, you get to pick the shutter speed in some cases and you don't in other cases. But what's most important here is that if you're in manual shooting mode and you look through your camera and you're setting the exposure and it says f11 at 1/100th, okay, that'll give you a perfect picture. But if you then change to 1/250th, 1/500th, 1/1000th, it's going to get darker. Or if you go the other way, down to a 60th, 30th, or a 15th, it's going to get a lot brighter, meaning overexposed or underexposed. So here's something to think about when it comes to controlling the ambient light with your shutter speed. So here's kind of a real rudimentary graph I created to kind of explain it. First of all, the red bar that's coming up and down is not abrupt like that. In my program, I couldn't figure out how to create a curved line. So it comes over from the left and the right straight in, when actually it would be sloping up. The flash builds up, its flash burst, and then it subsides. So if you have 1/30th set, the flash fires as soon as you click the shutter, but the shutter's open long enough to get the proper exposure for the ambient light in the background. Your subject's already been flashed within the first second, but you leave within the first instance. I mean, a 30th of a second isn't even a second, but it fires, illuminates your subject, but the shutter stays open. Then you go to a 60th, which is half the amount of time it's open compared to a 30th, and you now have a darker background, or 1/125th. But the point with this is that the flash fires, it doesn't really matter how long the shutter is open. The shutter is designed to control the ambient or background light. And then, by the way, I've been asked this, so I added it. Flash duration a lot of times is anywhere from 1/320th of a second up to 1/40,000th of a second. Going to depend on your flash and all that kind of stuff. This is really irrelevant, generally speaking. But you can Google this, and I don't cover it really in this presentation, but you can Google high-speed flash and look for some examples. And it might be a water drop coming out of a bottle where a drop went in, then it comes back up, camera and the flash fire, and it's so fast that it freezes it. At 1/350th or 1/320th, if that's the longest shutter speed or longest speed that flash is going, the output of flash is going, you might see a little blur in that water drop. So, okay, now controlling ambient light. On the left, we have f/5.6 at a 30th, and on the right, f/5.6 at a quarter. Again, this is how shutter speed's controlling the ambient light, but not the flash. Notice that she's pretty much properly exposed in both cases. Okay, and then another example, outdoors. 1/60th on the left, 1/20th on the right. Much brighter behind her, much darker on the left side. Now, this is important because as we go through the presentation, I'm going to say, I want a darker background, and that's why I did this. And all I'm doing is changing the shutter speed. Okay, now, more examples. A 60th of a second, very dark sky, a quarter of a second. So I prefer, of course, the quarter of a second, but you got to keep in mind when you're doing something like this, if they move, they're going to blur. So what you want to do is have a tripod, and you got to say, okay, hold real still, here we go, click. And then they didn't move. But I mean, if you look at the plants right next to the torch, they're blurring. So just to give you an idea that if it's too dark out and you still want a good background, you're going to have to really put it on a tripod with this long of a shutter speed and then ask your subject to hold as still as they can. Okay, now this happens to be a studio portrait, but again, the same logic applies. When I'm doing a studio portrait, I'm not in aperture priority mode ever, because when you're doing a studio portrait, you are using a lot of different lights to light your subject. I call it sculpting them with light. You have a lot of lights going on. And in the right picture, the ceiling lights are showing up as well as the light coming from the modeling lights in my strobes. This is not going to fly for a nice portrait. But on the left side, I'm using a 60th of a second. I'm always a 60th to about 1/125th when I'm in the studio, as long as I don't need any lights in there, like the ceiling lights to contribute to the picture, or I'm using maybe a video light for an effect. Then I would turn off the ceiling lights, and I'd have the strobes and the video light, which is constant, not a flash, to light this whole thing. So that's important. Okay, now we have EC, kind of slang for exposure compensation. Now, if you are, well, let me back up. Exposure compensation is compensating the exposure to either lighten or darken your photo from what the camera meter said. The camera meter is going to give you its best estimate by setting the shutter speed for you, like in aperture priority mode. But if it's too dark or too bright and you adjust your shutter speed to compensate, you're doing exposure compensation. That's all that is. Changing the background exposure to the brightness level you want, whether it's lighter or darker. Now, on some cameras, I haven't seen this in a while, they have an EC button, which mostly just a little button on the camera that has a plus and minus. That's for the same thing. you can press it and adjust your shutter speed when you're in the aperture priority or shutter priority or program modes. However, if you are in manual shooting mode, all you do is change the shutter speed. It's still exposure compensation, just a different way of changing the brightness of the ambient light. And this is an example of doing exactly that. On the left side, the flash exposure, it looks great on the flower in both cases, but of course the left side's darker than the bright side. And I went down, if I remember correctly, about 2 stops darker on the ambient light, yet the flower still stands out. So now, if you're shooting in an aperture priority type mode, an automatic mode, and you want to change the exposure compensation, this is what it looks like on my Canon camera. You just spin the dial on the shutter speed. On the left side, it shows a -1 in that little graph, and on the right side, it shows a +1 in that little graph. That's all you do to change the shutter or to change the brightness of the ambient light. I don't have a plus or minus EC button on my camera that I would choose to use instead. Okay, now we're going to talk about controlling the flash output. So when you're using automatic flash, basically the process is you focus on the subject, you take a picture, and the flash and camera do all the work by measuring the distance and establishing the proper flash output level. But change the f-stop and the flash automatically changes the output in ETTL type modes, automatic flash. So this is great for moving subjects. Can't tell you how many times I've photographed like mountain bikers and runners, and I want to add a little flash on them for flash fill purposes because it's sunny outside. As they're running by, the subject to flash distance is changing constantly. And so this is the true value of TTL. I mean, there's lots of great value for TTL, but for me and what I do, that is a great value in adjusting the flash's output level to properly expose the subject while they're moving farther or closer to the camera. But if you want more control over that, like even when you're doing the TTL of the mountain biker riding by and there's too much flash hitting them, you would then move into flash exposure compensation, also known as FEC. Flash exposure compensation is not a whole lot different than exposure compensation, but with exposure compensation, you're lightening or darkening the background. With flash exposure compensation, you're only changing the flash's output level beyond what it thinks it's supposed to do when you're using TTL. So the way you do that for controlling flash, and this is again on an older Canon camera, left side, that's the FEC button. It's a dual button. It does a couple different things, but you can see that crooked little arrow with the plus and minus sign next to it. That is flash exposure compensation for changing the output level of the flash. Then on the right photo, you'll notice that currently the flash is set to full output level, so no flash exposure compensation has been applied yet. Then you come over here, and I want to reduce the amount of flash output, and again, I'm in TTL. I will just press that FEC button and spin the dial a little bit until it goes to -1. Now it's only outputting half the power that it determined was needed for a proper flash exposure, but it's only going to output half of it. And the advantage of that is if you're in the sun and there's lots of shadows, you're just brightening those shadows up enough, but you're not eliminating them like you would with full flash. Then on the right side, it's very possible you're shooting something and it's just not bright enough. Again, I would hold down the FEC button and spin the dial to give it plus flash output to brighten up the subject. Now, your camera may not even have an FEC button, just like it doesn't have an EC button. That's going to happen in other ways, so you're going to have to look at your manual on how to adjust your flash's output. Now, let's take a look at what that looks like. On the left side is normal flash output. In the middle is a -1 FEC. It looks pretty natural. It's very, very subtle. I shoot this way a lot if I want to just brighten up the shadow. So let's go back to the image on the left, no FEC. Look at the shadow under her chin and how dark it is and how abrupt it is. Then I don't want that much flash, so I go to the middle image and I reduce the flash output by 1 stop, and now it's a very weak shadow and it looks much more natural. And even on an overcast day, I will use something like this to fill in the eye sockets that can go a little bit dark if the sun's very high, but also on an overcast day, same thing. It can make the eye sockets a little darker, so I will add the flash to fill those in. Then on the right side, I never do this, but this is just an example of adding flash using FEC. She's not only got that hard shadow under the chin, but she's also washed out, blown out, over flashed, and so on. Okay, so now we're looking at changing flash output level, but not changing the ambient light level. So we didn't touch EC, we're touching FEC. So on the left side, we have a normal full flash. Then on the right side, we have a -1 FEC. So she's a little bit darker. Then on the right, a -2 FEC, and she's pretty dark. But the background hasn't changed, and that is key. So there's the difference between EC and FEC. Now, let's move on to manual flash. Okay, manual flash mode. Well, why would you want to use manual flash mode? The reason is TTL can be inconsistent. I just described the mountain biker riding by, getting closer to the camera, and how the TTL adjusts the flash output. But in manual mode, it's only going to output 1 level of flash. And let's say you choose quarter power, it's going to be the same output every single time, even if that mountain biker gets closer. They'll be dark, they'll be normal, then they'll be over flashed. You don't want that. TTL is better for that type of thing. Where manual flash is good is when you're taking the same picture over and over. And let's just say this is going to be somebody in the park that you're taking a high school senior portrait of. And they're standing in the same spot, and you're going to take about 15 different poses of them in the same spot. The flash to subject distance is not going to change. That's when you want to use manual flash. And that's how I do it. And it's the only way to do it in my mind. When you've got manual flash going on, there are no variables. Again, I just mentioned the subject to flash distance. As long as the subject doesn't move, this works great. You can also get the flash off the camera, and that's actually how I use manual flash. I don't use it on the camera. When I have it on the camera, I'm using TTL. When I have it off the camera and I'm taking that portrait in the park, I, for the most part, have it set to manual flash. Now, when it comes to the manual flash, everything is going to be set manually. And that means you're going to set up your flash over to the side for that portrait. You're going to take a picture. If they're too bright, you change the output level. Or if they're too dark, you change the output level. So if they're too bright, you're going to reduce the flash output. If they're too dark, you're going to increase the flash output. And you can have a manual flash and a controller on your camera to make those increase or decrease the flash output. And that works great. So you don't have to keep leaving, going to the flash, changing the output, and going back. You can do it manually with the controller, usually in your hot shoe, that actually triggers the wireless flash to go. The other nice part about manual is you can set ratios. If you're doing portraits, usually you have a main light and you have a fill light. And that's 2 flashes. And you could have hair lights and other flashes behind. And you can control those and control the output. So let's say the flash that's off to the side lighting the subject, that's your key flash. That's going to bring you X amount of brightness on the subject. Once you set it perfectly, then you can adjust the other flash in the hot shoe to fill in the shadows. And so they don't have to be set the same, and you can do it all from the camera. All right, so here's just different versions of manual flash mode. And the left one this is the cover of my ebook on outdoor flash photography. The flash is on the other side, just lighting up that wall to create an effect. Now, TTL, I could have used TTL, but there's no reason to. I can do it with manual flash, and it's going to be the same distance every time. It's going to work perfect. Or the portrait outdoors I just talked about, having it off to the side. Every single picture I took for this guy for a magazine was exactly the same exposure. And then, of course, if you want to use flashes for studio lighting, you absolutely can. It works great. And in this case, same thing. The subject to flash, distance doesn't change, so manual is perfect. Now, to control the manual flash, you would change your aperture, but you only want to do that if depth of field is not a priority. Meaning, if you set your flash to quarter power and then you change from f8 to f11, less light's going to hit the subject. They're going to be a little bit darker, and you can do that with your aperture. Here's something to keep in mind. When you change to manual flash mode, this is a really old flash of mine, but it says what it needs to say. I'm choosing different apertures and the flash distance. There's no more range. There's no more 8 feet to 20 feet flash range. That's only in TTL. In TTL, the flash will output enough flash for 8 feet if that's where your subject is, or 22 feet if that's where your subject is. In manual flash, there's only a flash point and a specific area where the flash will deliver a good exposure. If your subject, well, let's just look here. On the left side, flash output level is 1:1. You can see that right below zoom. 1:1, that's full output. The flash cannot output any more light than 1:1. The flash point, that's the point where perfect exposure will come from the flash, is 20 feet. At f5.6, it's 30 feet. At f16, it's 10 feet because the smaller aperture lets in less light. And as such, this is going to help you figure some things out. But what if you need f8 at 10 feet? And it wasn't shown in those last examples. So here, 1:1, f8, 20 feet. And your ISO will affect that. And in all these cases right here, it's ISO 100. So at 1:1, f8, your subject needs to be 20 feet. But if you want them at 10 feet, then you just go in and change the flash output level from 1:1 to a quarter power. 1/4 is quarter power. Now your subject can be 10 feet and they will get the proper amount of flash for a good exposure. And then here's an example where I applied it. I'm photographing this guy for Oregon tourism, and he's out on a hiking trail. It's for the recreational part of it, the job or the assignment. And so the first picture, I didn't have enough flash output because I was at a quarter power. He's not bright enough. So I just simply reset the flash's output to half power, and now he's much more normally exposed from the flash. So it's very easy. When you're working in manual flash mode, you have to test. You set your flash up where you think it is, or you set your flash up where it has to be set up. And then you adjust the output for a proper flash exposure like this. Now this is a super wide angle 15 millimeter lens. The flash is just to the left of the ferns on the left side of the photograph. It's as close to him as I can get, but I can't get any closer without seeing the flash. Now today, of course, put the flash in the picture and retouch it out in Photoshop. I do that all the time. But for the sake of what we're demonstrating here, we don't want to do any Photoshop work at this point. So, okay, now reminders of the power of using TTL. Basically, you can just point and shoot. The flash measures the output automatically. So you should get an accurate flash exposure every single time, but it can be fooled. Flash is consistent no matter the shooting mode, so it doesn't really matter what shooting mode you're in when you're not talking about sync speed. The flash output adjusts when the exposure settings change. Again, you change from f8 to f11, it's going to adjust the output to keep that same exposure. So you can control the exposure for flash with one adjustment: your aperture with manual flash, or FEC, flash exposure compensation, when you're using TTL. You control exposure for the ambient with another adjustment, and that is your shutter speed, or in the slang, EC. Manual flash, you get consistent output. You adjust that output with different power levels. You adjust the flash exposure with your aperture. Those are two different things. You're only going to pick one or the other. You can adjust your flash with the power levels, which is what I do, or you can adjust the flash with the aperture. When flash to subject distance changes, you need to retest and then readjust the flash output level to make sure they're still properly exposed. Hey, you've got a flash. This is going to be about flash fill and flash key and how you can apply those to your subjects. Okay, well, what is flash key? Flash key means that the flash is your main light source. So if you're in a studio, for example, and you want to do a portrait and you're going to use a flash to do it, that would be your primary light that comes in from an angle, lights the side of your subject's face, and creates light that shapes their face. So you'd have a highlight side and a shadow side. Flash fill is the opposite of flash key. You got flash key over here. Flash fill comes from the camera and fills in the shadows that are created by the flash key. So here's an example of flash key. The flash is the brightest light source, and by the way, despite the fact you see the sun on the background, this guy's standing in the shade. And this is a perfect scenario for using flash key. It's just off to the side, coming in, lighting the front of him, and as a result, he looks as if he's in the background as far as the same brightness level on that, and so on. And so that's what you want to create with a flash key. Now here, flash fill. The sun is hitting her in the face in the left photograph, and look at the contrast from the sun. You know that you have no control over the angle of the sun. You can change your subject's position to try to, benefit or use that light better, but for the most part, you can't move the sun. And as such, the shadow on the side of her face is really pretty ugly. So add a flash in a flash fill situation, and it fills in those shadows of her. Another thing you can do is you can turn flash fill into flash key so that what was your flash fill becomes the dominant light source. And I'll show you all this coming up. And this is an example of a self-portrait I did with the flash in my hand. The flash is the brightest light source in this particular situation. And notice how it makes me stand out from the background. This is perfect and exactly how you might want to apply flash to some of your subjects, especially if they're humans outside. So first, let's just take a look here at this garden windmill and give you an idea of how flash fill and flash key work. And this is turning flash fill into flash key. I'll show you the process. So here we go. No flash, f22 at a 60th of a second. The wind had it spinning pretty good. It's a little bit blurred even at a 60th. Now I turned on the flash. And if you look under the center of this windmill, you can see there's a little shadow there. That's flash fill at a weakened power. Notice that the sun is coming from the upper right and is creating shadows on these plastic blades of this fan. You can see them right here. They're much more subtle as far as the brightness level than they were in the previous picture, which showed much harsher shadows. So we've added flash fill just to weaken the shadows by filling them in. Now I've turned this into a flash key. Notice how dark the background went. The fill flash, which you can clearly see the shadow now, has become a key light. And the reason is I changed the shutter speed to 1/125th by using EC, purposely darkened the background. That made the flash a flash key by underexposing the sunlight. So as I continue to go further with this, notice how bright the actual little plastic windmill is versus the background's even darker. That's because I went to 1/250th. Now let's take a look at flash fill. On the left side, we saw this in the last video, no flash at all. Then in the second from the left, this one, full flash. Then -1 flash exposure compensation, -2 flash exposure compensation. So again, we saw this, but it's giving you an idea of the output level of the flash, and the shutter speed can change everything all around from flash fill to flash key. In the image on the left, it's nice and bright out. Rafting the Grand Canyon, nice and bright. And the flash has been added only to fill in under the brim of his hat. Notice the lady behind him. She's still got a shadow on her face because she's getting less flashlight on her than he is because she's much further back. But she's still getting some as a flash fill. Then on the right, it's dark outside. And as such, the flash fill is acting more like a flash key because it's the brightest light source. So there's a couple other things you can do with your flash to control the softness of the flash output. This happens to be called a flash bender, and I got it at B&H, but anyway, it works great for diffusing and softening the quality of light. When would I use this? Well, here's a magazine cover I shot one time, and I used flash. And I used a device similar to the flash bender that isn't made anymore, and I don't even have it anymore. But if you look at her face, you can see the light is coming from the right side, and there's a nice little light pattern from her nose onto her cheek that's on the left, and there's some shadowing and stuff like that. So it's getting the flash off the camera, using the diffuse flash as a flash key light, and it's creating nice contrast and a nice light pattern on her face. Then we got bounce flash. Most of the time when you're bouncing your flash, you're using a ceiling. And the reason you're using a ceiling is your flash is this big, the top of it, but when it goes up and hits the ceiling, it becomes much, much bigger of a light source as it comes back down onto your subject. So that's called diffusing the light or softening it. You can fill a whole room, depending on the size of that room, with one bounce flash. And it works really, really well. It works as a diffuser as long as you're okay with your light coming from above. So how do you bounce the flash? All right, you just flip it up when it's in your hot shoe, bounces off the ceiling, comes down and hits your subject, and it works really well. You can also do verticals the same way by just rotating the head of your flash, bouncing it off the ceiling and going down and hitting your subject. And when I do this, I'm using the TTL features on my flash, the automatic flash, because again, I'm bouncing the light off the ceiling, coming down. I want the camera to meter it and make sure it's a proper flash exposure. Okay, if you got a group and you need to be a little farther back, use the zoom feature on the flash to narrow the beam of light, then tilt it down a little bit so the light goes out a little further off the ceiling and comes down and hits them. And it works great because it can fill up a small room quite effectively. So here's an example of no flash of a realtor in his office. And then this is direct flash. Flash in the hot shoe, going in there. And notice how harsh and contrasty that light is on him. If you look at his collar, there's little shadows and things like that, but there's also highlights in the glasses. And it's just not really very appealing. I call it mugshot lighting a lot of times because it's very flat. It looks like he's been booked. Now I bounce the flash off the ceiling, and it's a softer quality light. And notice the shadow that's under the collar now. It's a more diffused, softer shadow, but it also is creating a shadow under his chin more than in the previous picture. So there's ways to address that. And it's to attach a bounce reflector to the flash unit. The light goes up and hits the ceiling, but the white also sends light directly towards him. Now, this is just a piece of foam core. You can do this by going to the art store or any store and buying a piece of white foam core, cutting it to fit, using rubber bands to hold it to the flash. I did this for years, and it works great. Or I just showed you a picture of that flash bender, which is more you can manipulate it a little bit better to direct the light where you want it to go. You can bend the top of the flash bender to control how much bounces off the ceiling versus how much goes directly at your subject. So this is one way you can do that. When you add this to your flash, you've changed the quality of light, just like this diagram shows. Most of the light comes off the ceiling, but a lot of it is bounced right at them. That is a really great way. Here is a picture I created just using that same setup. However, it flashes off to the side in a wireless capacity, and the shadow that's under his chin is not so deep like it would be if it was bounced, so it was just off to the side. Okay, so that's a wrap on my introduction to flash photography, the very basics, which is mostly light, how you can control the ambient light, and how you can control the flash output. Hey, thanks for watching New Photography School. Be sure and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming tutorials. Keep shooting.